COVID-19 comparisons between Ebola versus coronavirus. How is the coronavirus different? Our genetic code is written in the 4 letters of DNA: A, C, G, and T. Our DNA is copied, and these copies find their way into sperm and egg to combine and eventually develop into a new human. DNA also makes messenger RNA, copies of genes, which are then translated into proteins by ribosomes in the cell cytoplasm. This is the standard DNA, RNA, protein world that we all live in. Viruses can take advantage of this system by hijacking the machinery of other living things and tricking them into making copies of the virus, which then can burst from the invaded cell and infect new cells. The genetic code of some viruses is made up of DNA like us. Hepatitis B and Epstein-Barr are examples of DNA viruses that infect humans. Some viruses, including our COVID-19, hepatitis C, Ebola, SARS, influenza, polio, measles, and HIV are RNA viruses. The genetic code is written in RNA, not DNA. RNA is similar in structure to DNA, but contains uracil instead of thymidine, U instead of T as one of the 4 letters. RNA viruses are further subdivided into whether their RNA is single-stranded, like our mRNA, or double-stranded, like our DNA. If the RNA carries the code directly, without having to be read in reverse, then it is called a positive-stranded RNA virus. Most, including COVID-19, are single-stranded. There are 8 families of single-stranded positive-sense viruses that infect vertebrates and Coronaviridae. The family that includes coronaviruses is among these 8. Coronaviridae is also characterized by having an enveloped capsid. The capsid is the protein shell around the virus. The envelope is a lipid layer that coats the capsid. Like other viruses, coronaviruses are specialized to infect particular species or groups of species. Coronaviruses specialize in infecting birds and mammals. We classify coronaviruses as zoonotic because these viruses can cross species barriers and infect humans from other animal species. Coronaviruses are further subdivided into 4 smaller groups or genera, including alpha, beta, gamma, and delta coronaviruses. COVID-19 is a beta coronavirus. To summarize, COVID-19 is a zoonotic, single-stranded, positive-sense RNA virus with an enveloped capsid, a member of Coronaviridae, a member of the genus beta coronavirus. Now that tells a lot about what COVID-19 is and is not. That's quite a lot to take in. There are a lot of other beta coronaviruses infecting a wide variety of animals, from bats to porcupines, and COVID-19 is only one of them. We're paying particular attention to COVID-19 now because late last year it made the jump from some other animal to humans. Perhaps this animal was a bat or a pangolin that transferred the virus to one of our food animals that ended up at a meat market, and this is where the jump happened. Another very similar beta coronavirus was responsible for the 2003 outbreak of SARS, which can be abbreviated as SARS-CoV, which describes a coronavirus that causes severe acute respiratory syndrome. COVID-19 is also a severe acute respiratory infection. So, are these the same thing? The simple answer is no. This one is a different strain that has not been previously identified. But SARS-CoV is currently the most closely related virus that we know of. What do we call the virus? SARS-CoV-2. And the disease is called COVID-19, which stands for Coronavirus Disease from 2019. So let's compare the coronavirus to H1N1, Ebola, and SARS. Let's take a look at past epidemics here for a second. The H1N1, or the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919, was the worst pandemic in modern history. It was a zoonotic virus that came from birds and infected 1 in 3 people on Earth. It coincided with World War I, which meant that soldiers from all over the world were fighting in Europe and then bringing the infection home with them. 50 million people died, as we said earlier. The thing that made H1N1 so terrifying is that it killed people who were otherwise young, strong, and healthy. Every year we have a new variation of the flu, which is why we get a new flu vaccine every year. Some flu strains are worse than others. The big one could be some future flu strain. But, as we said earlier, COVID-19 is not as bad as H1N1. Ebola virus disease is another epidemic we have all heard about. Another zoonotic virus, Ebola can have a death rate of up to 90%. And although Ebola spread from person to person through contact with infected body fluids, the transmission is not airborne. The SARS epidemic of 2003 was produced by a beta coronavirus that is very, very similar to COVID-19. SARS killed 14 to 15% of those it infected and had a mortality rate above 50% for those over 65. But SARS did not spread as easily as COVID-19 and did not become a pandemic. The progression of the 2003 SARS epidemic. Note the vertical blue bars indicating new cases rise with time and then taper off, indicating that SARS did not become an endemic. Comparing H1N1, Ebola, SARS, and COVID-19 illustrates how factors such as mode of transmission, ease of transmission, and virulence interact to determine an epidemic's potential for harm. COVID-19 can be contracted through the air. Now this is bad, but COVID-19 spreads more easily than SARS and much more easily than Ebola. This is worrying, but COVID-19 is not as deadly as SARS and nowhere nearly as deadly as Ebola. Putting all this in context, COVID-19 is likely to reach pandemic stage, but is unlikely to upend the world as we know it. We will survive this, and what we learn from it in controlling pandemics could save us from the next big one. We humans are crafty Thanks to the doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists protecting us all. Now would be a good time to talk about the differences among epidemic, pandemic, and endemic. An epidemic is a regional outbreak of a disease. A pandemic occurs when an epidemic spreads globally. If that virus returns year after year, it becomes endemic. The flu, for example, is an endemic virus, but it is constantly evolving. H1N1 was a particularly nasty strain of the flu virus, and H1 and N1 refer to different types of hemagglutinin, or H, as neuraminidase N proteins. There are 60 known types of H proteins and 9 types of N protein, and the combination of H1N1 was particularly virulent. COVID-19 started as an epidemic in China, but has now been declared by the World Health Organization as a pandemic.